The gavel's crack echoed through Courtroom 304 like a gunshot, but Sarah Washington didn't flinch. Chicago's Municipal Court building loomed ancient and imposing, its tall windows filtering morning light into sharp, accusatory beams. The wooden benches creaked with nervous energy, packed with people who understood that justice here was less about fairness and more about survival. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff's thunderous, "All rise," reverberated off marble walls, a ritual that had crushed more spirits than it had ever protected. Judge William Thorne walked in, his silver hair perfectly combed, his black robe pressed without a single wrinkle. Rumor had it he ironed it himself every morning, a metaphor, perhaps, for how meticulously he controlled every aspect of his courtroom. His face was a topography of stern lines, each wrinkle a testament to 3 decades of unchallenged authority. Sarah sat in the middle row, dressed simply in blue jeans, a white t-shirt, and comfortable sneakers. No jewelry, no makeup. Just her, a small parking ticket, and a phone. Around her, people clutched their paperwork like shields, their eyes downcast. But Sarah's gaze was steady, calm. She looked like someone who had nothing to lose, or everything to prove. What Judge Thorne didn't know was that this ordinary Monday morning would become the most memorable day of his 30-year career. And Sarah Washington was about to teach him a lesson about power, prejudice, and the true meaning of justice. As case after case was called, a quiet storm was brewing. Each harsh sentence, each dismissive wave of the judge's hand, was setting the stage for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of Chicago's judicial system. Sarah Washington wasn't just another defendant. She was a catalyst, a mirror reflecting the ugly truth of systemic bias. When her name was called, the courtroom held its breath. No one, not the nervous clerk, not the bored bailiff, not Judge Thorne himself, had any idea what was about to unfold. Sometimes, the most powerful revolution begins with something as simple as a parking ticket. The Washington Tech Solutions headquarters didn't look like a typical tech company. Nestled in a renovated warehouse in Chicago's West Loop, the building was a testament to Sarah Washington's unconventional approach to innovation. Exposed brick walls were lined with digital screens showing real-time data from their AI projects, while engineers and designers moved between open workspaces dressed in everything from tailored suits to vintage band t-shirts. Sarah's office wasn't a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows. Instead, it was a modest space near the center of the open floor plan, deliberately positioned to be accessible to everyone in the company. Her desk was simple, a reclaimed wood table with multiple monitors, each displaying different project dashboards, research data, and global news feeds. At 35, Sarah Washington was something of a legend in the tech world. Her journey hadn't been the typical Silicon Valley narrative of privileged college dropouts and venture capital. Born to a public school teacher mother and a postal worker father in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, Sarah had learned early that opportunity was something you created, not something that was given. Her first computer had been a refurbished desktop her mother had saved for months to buy, understanding her daughter's insatiable curiosity about technology. By the time Sarah was 14, she was building custom computers for neighbors, charging enough to help her family with household expenses. High school was a blur of advanced mathematics, computer science clubs, and part-time jobs. Scholarships had taken her to the University of Illinois, where she double-majored in computer science and public policy. It was an unusual combination that hinted at her future vision. Technology wasn't just about creating cool products, but about solving real-world problems. Washington Tech Solutions had started in her small studio apartment 7 years ago. The company's first project was an AI system designed to help public defenders analyze case data more efficiently, reducing the impact of systemic biases in the legal system. Investors had been skeptical. A young black woman talking about using AI for social justice? It seemed like a nonprofit dream, not a billion-dollar business strategy. But Sarah had a gift for proving people wrong. Her company now employs 450 people, with projects ranging from healthcare AI that could detect early-stage diseases in underserved communities to educational technology that personalized learning for students with different learning capabilities. Each project carried the same core philosophy: technology should be a tool for leveling the playing field. At home, Sarah lived simply. A modest three-bedroom house in Evanston, inherited from her grandmother, was more library than showcase. Walls were lined with books, technology journals, civil rights histories, biographies of change makers. Her library was a map of her intellectual journey, showing how deeply she believed that understanding history was crucial to building a better future. Family meant everything to her. Her mother, Rebecca, still taught high school mathematics in the same neighborhood where Sarah grew up. Her father, Robert, had passed away 5 years ago, but his lessons about dignity, hard work, and standing up for others remained her most cherished inheritance. Every major decision she made, she imagined running by him first. Weekends were for community work. Sarah volunteered with local tech education programs, teaching coding to high school students in neighborhoods similar to the one she'd grown up in. She didn't just donate money, she showed up, talked to students, and shared her own story of transformation. Her team knew her as someone who led by example. No task was beneath her. She'd been known to jump into customer service chats, debug code alongside junior developers, and spend hours in strategy meetings listening more than she spoke. Power, to Sarah, wasn't about titles or wealth. It was about creating meaningful change. The parking ticket that would change everything was just another small moment in a life dedicated to challenging systems. She had no idea that morning how profoundly she was about to demonstrate her life's core belief, that true power comes from seeing and challenging injustice, one small battle at a time. The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of Chicago's Municipal Court building as people shuffled into Courtroom 304. It was 8:45 a.m. and the wooden benches were already filling up with nervous faces. Judge William Thorne's reputation made everyone anxious, especially on Monday mornings. At 62 years old, Judge Thorne carried himself with the stern authority of someone who had spent 30 years behind the bench. His silver hair was always perfectly calm, and his black robe pressed without a single wrinkle. The court officers often whispered that he ironed it himself every morning. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom exactly at 9 a.m. Judge Thorne walked in, his face already set in its usual frown. "You didn't like Mondays, and everyone knew it. Be seated," he said without looking up, his voice carrying the weight of someone who expected immediate obedience. The shuffling of feet and rustling of clothes filled the room as people sat down. Among those waiting was Sarah Washington, sitting quietly in the middle row. She was dressed in simple blue jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and comfortable sneakers. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore no makeup or jewelry. Next to her, people clutched their tickets and paperwork, but Sarah only had her phone and a small parking ticket in her hands. The morning proceeded like clockwork. Judge Thorne handled case after case, his mood growing worse with each person who stepped forward. He gave no one more than 2 minutes to explain themselves. His sentences were harsh: maximum fines for minor violations, and no mercy for late payments. "Case number 47, called out the court clerk. "Sarah Washington, parking violation on Michigan Avenue." Sarah stood up gracefully, her movements calm and controlled as she walked toward the front of the courtroom. An old lady sitting nearby whispered, "Poor dear. She picked a bad day to face old Thorne." Judge Thorne didn't even look up when Sarah reached the podium. He was too busy writing something in his notebook, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "Ms. Washington," he said, still not looking up, "you parked in a loading zone for 45 minutes on Thursday afternoon. Do you deny this charge?" "Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances," Sarah began, her voice clear and professional. "It's a simple question." Judge Thorne cut her off, finally looking up. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw her. "Do you deny parking in a marked loading zone?" Yes or no? The courtroom was silent. Everyone could feel the tension building. Judge Thorne's treatment of minorities was well known in Chicago, though no one had ever successfully complained about it. No, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. I don't deny it. However, there were extenuating circumstances that day. There are no extenuating circumstances for breaking the law. Judge Thorne interrupted again, his voice carrying that special tone he reserved for certain defendants, condescending and harsh. Sarah stood straight, her expression remaining neutral despite the judge's obvious bias. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, some with pity, others with understanding. The young court clerk, Jenny Martinez, watched the scene with growing discomfort. She had been working in this courtroom for 6 months and had seen this pattern too many times. A $50 ticket would become $500 for some defendants, while others would get away with a warning. The fine for parking in a loading zone is typically $100, Judge Thorne announced, shuffling some papers on his desk. However, given the length of time and the... He paused, looking at Sarah's casual clothes with obvious disapproval. Blatant disregard for business operations in the area, I'm setting the fine at $2,500. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Those who had seen Judge Thorne's harsh sentences before raised their eyebrows at the excessive amount. But Sarah didn't flinch. She stood there perfectly still, her face showing no reaction to the outrageous fine. The only movement was her right hand, which calmly reached for her phone. Little did Judge William Thorne know that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become the most memorable day of his 30-year career. And Sarah Washington was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. As she held her phone steadily, pulling up her banking app, the courtroom held its collective breath. The tension was palpable, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface of what seemed like a routine traffic court proceeding. Jenny Martinez, the court clerk, began typing faster than usual, making sure to record every word of the exchange. Something about this moment felt different. The air was charged with an electricity that suggested something momentous was about to happen. Sarah Washington stood at the podium, phone in hand, ready to challenge not just a parking fine, but an entire system of judicial bias that had gone unchecked for far too long. Her calm demeanor masked a determination that was about to shake the foundations of Chicago's municipal court system. Sarah Washington held her phone steadily as she pulled up her banking app. Judge Thorne watched her with a mix of impatience and satisfaction, expecting her to plead for more time to pay the unfair fine. Your Honor, Sarah spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. Before I pay this fine, I'd like to understand why the amount is 25 times the standard penalty. Judge Thorne's face reddened slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by defendants. Miss Washington, he interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. This court's decisions are not up for debate. If you can't pay the fine today, we can discuss a payment plan. The smile on his face made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Jenny Martinez, the court clerk, began typing faster than usual, making sure to record every word of the exchange. That won't be necessary, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. I'm simply trying to understand the legal basis for such a large increase. Is there something specific in my case that warrants this exceptional fine? The judge's smile disappeared. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on his desk. Are you questioning my authority, Ms. Washington? Not at all, Your Honor, she responded, her voice respectful but firm. As a citizen, don't I have the right to understand why I'm being fined $2,500 for a standard parking violation? A few whispers spread through the courtroom. Bailiff Officer Thompson watched the exchange with growing interest. In his 15 years working in this courtroom, he had never seen anyone challenge Judge Thorne so calmly and professionally. Young lady, Judge Thorne's voice took on an even more patronizing tone. Perhaps you don't understand how things work here. This is my courtroom, and I decide the appropriate penalties based on the circumstances. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. And what circumstances led to this decision, Your Honor? Is there something in my driving record that concerns you? Judge Thorne shuffled through the papers in front of him, knowing full well that Sarah's record was clean. His face grew redder as he realized she was backing him into a corner. "Miss Washington, your attitude is not helping your case," he warned, trying to regain control of the situation. "I could increase the fine further for contempt of court." The threat hung in the air, but Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out her reading glasses and put them on. "Your Honor, I've been nothing but respectful. I'm simply exercising my right to understand the judicial process. Would you mind if I took notes?" She pulled out a small notebook from her back pocket, a simple action that somehow made Judge Thorne more uncomfortable than any angry outbursts could have. "What exactly are you writing?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Just documenting today's proceedings, Your Honor. The time, date, original violation, and your specific reasons for increasing the fine," she replied, looking up at him with genuine curiosity. "Would you like me to read back what you've stated so far?" The courtroom was now completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Everyone watched as Judge Thorne's face went from red to almost purple. "This is highly irregular," he sputtered, picking up his gavel. "I will not have you disrupting my courtroom with these tricks. I'd apologize if asking for clarity seems disruptive, Your Honor," Sarah replied, still writing in her notebook. "I'm simply creating a record of this interaction. I'm sure the court keeps similar records, correct?" She glanced meaningfully at Jenny Martinez, who was still typing everything diligently. Judge Thorne suddenly noticed Jenny's rapid typing and shot her a sharp look. The young clerk pretended not to notice, keeping her eyes fixed on her computer screen. "Enough!" Judge Thorne banged his gavel. "Pay the fine or face additional penalties. This is your final warning, Miss Washington." Sarah closed her notebook slowly and placed it back in her pocket. "Of course, Your Honor. I'll pay the fine right now." She tapped a few buttons on her phone, her movements deliberate and calm. "Would you like the receipt sent to the court's email, or should I have my office deliver a hard copy?" Something about the way she said, "my office," made Judge Thorne pause for the first time that morning. He felt a slight twinge of uncertainty. Who exactly was this woman in simple clothes who took such careful notes, and spoke about her office? The courtroom held its collective breath, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Sarah Washington had transformed from just another defendant into something far more formidable, a mirror reflecting the systemic biases that had gone unchallenged for far too long. While Sarah was completing the payment on her phone, Jenny Martinez, the court clerk, was scrolling through her device during a brief pause in the proceedings. Her eyes suddenly widened. She had been sure Sarah Washington looked familiar, and now she knew why. "Oh my God!" Jenny whispered to herself, quickly showing her phone to the bailiff beside her. Officer Thompson's mouth fell open slightly as he looked at the Forbes magazine article on Jenny's screen. The headline read, "Sarah Washington, the brilliant mind behind Washington Tech Solutions, how this self-made billionaire is changing the future." The bailiff quickly wrote a note and walked it up to Judge Thorne's bench. The judge, still looking smugly at Sarah, barely glanced at the note at first. Then his eyes darted back to it, and all the color drained from his face. "Miss Washington," he said, his voice suddenly much softer, "there seems to be a small confusion here." Sarah looked up from her phone, having just completed the payment. "No confusion at all, Your Honor. The $2,500 fine has been paid in full." She smiled politely. "Would you like to see the confirmation?" By now, Jenny's discovery was spreading through the courtroom in whispers. People were pulling out their phones, searching for Sarah Washington's name. The quiet buzz of excitement grew as more people realized who was standing before them. "That's her, the AI company founder. She's worth billions. I saw her on TV last week." Judge Thorne's hands were shaking slightly as he removed his reading glasses. The woman standing before him wasn't just any defendant. She was Sarah Washington, the founder and CEO of Washington Tech Solutions, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the world. Her company had recently made headlines for developing groundbreaking artificial intelligence systems that were revolutionizing healthcare. "Miss Washington," Judge Thorne cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss this matter in my chambers. Sarah checked the time on her phone. I don't think that's necessary, Your Honor. The fine has been paid. She paused, looking directly at him. Unless there's something else you'd like to discuss, perhaps the reasoning behind the increased fine amount? The judge's forehead was now covered in small beads of sweat. The sane woman he had been treating condescendingly moments ago was regularly meeting with world leaders and had more money than he could earn in 1,000 lifetimes. A young intern from the back of the courtroom rushed forward, holding a newspaper. Miss Washington, I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you mind signing this? Your article about improving access to technology in underprivileged communities was inspiring. Before Sarah could respond, more people in the courtroom began speaking up. My daughter got one of your STEM scholarships. Your company's medical AI saved my mother's life. I use your app every day. Judge Thorne sat frozen in his chair, watching as his courtroom transformed into an impromptu fan meeting. Sarah handled the attention with grace, smiling kindly but maintaining her professional demeanor. Thank you all, she said quietly. But we should respect the court's proceedings. She turned back to Judge Thorne. Your Honor, since my case is concluded, may I be excused? The judge could only nod, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. But Sarah wasn't finished. One more thing, Your Honor, she said, pulling out her notebook again. I noticed some interesting patterns in today's proceedings. My legal team will be reviewing the court records from your previous sessions. We believe in equal justice for everyone, regardless of their appearance or social status. The message was clear. Judge Thorne's face turned pale as he realized the implications. Sarah Washington had the resources and influence to examine every decision he'd ever made from the bench. Have a good day, Your Honor, Sarah said, turning to leave. As she walked toward the door, she stopped by Jenny's desk. Miss Martinez, thank you for your diligent record-keeping today. Expect a call from my office. We might need copies of today's transcripts. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Sarah Washington, dressed in her simple jeans and t-shirt, walked out with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the entire proceeding. Behind her, she left a shaken judge, an impressed audience, and the beginning of what would become a major investigation into judicial bias in the Chicago court system. 1 week after the courtroom incident, Sarah Washington's legal team had taken over a whole floor of their downtown Chicago office building. 20 data analysts sat at computers, going through thousands of court records. The walls were covered with charts and graphs showing Judge Thorne's sentencing patterns. James Chin, Sarah's chief lawyer, stood in front of a large screen presenting the findings to Sarah. It's worse than we thought, he said, pointing to a colored graph. In the last 5 years, Judge Thorne gave minorities fines that were on average 300% higher than those given to white defendants for the same violations. Sarah, now dressed in a simple business suit, studied the numbers carefully. What about jail time for similar offenses? James clicked to the next slide. Even more disturbing. African American defendants were 4 times more likely to get jail time instead of probation. Hispanic defendants were 3 times more likely. The door opened, and Jenny Martinez walked in. After the incident, she quit her job as a court clerk and joined Sarah's team as a key witness. More people are coming forward, she announced, holding up a stack of papers. I got 50 new testimonies from previous defendants. Sarah turned to face the room full of workers. Remember everyone, this isn't just about Judge Thorne anymore. We're looking at the entire system. Across town, Judge Thorne was facing his crisis. He sat in a meeting room with 3 members of the Judicial Inquiry Board. The local news had been running stories about him all week, showing old footage of his courtroom and interviewing former defendants. Judge Thorne, one board member said, we've reviewed the initial evidence. Can you explain why a simple parking ticket resulted in a $2,500 fine for Ms. Washington? Thorne wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. I was having a bad day, he stammered. A bad day? Another board member raised her eyebrows. We found hundreds of cases where you gave unusually harsh sentences. Were you having a bad day for the past 5 years? Before he could answer, his lawyer whispered something in his ear. The truth was, Judge Thorne had never thought anyone would check his records. He had felt untouchable in his courtroom for so long. Back at Washington Tech Solutions, Sarah was meeting with civil rights leaders from across the city. The conference room was packed with community activists, religious leaders, and local politicians. What we found in Judge Thorne's courtroom isn't unique, Sarah explained, showing them the data. But we can use this case to push for real change. Reverend Jackson, a longtime civil rights activist, nodded in agreement. This is the evidence we needed for years. But taking on the entire judicial system will make you some powerful enemies. Sarah smiled. I didn't build a billion-dollar company by avoiding challenges. Besides, what's the point of having resources if we don't use them to fix broken systems? The investigation was making waves beyond Chicago. National news networks picked up the story. Other cities started looking at their court records. Sarah's team received calls from civil rights organizations across the country, all wanting to use her data analysis methods to examine their local courts. That evening, Sarah sat in her office looking out over the Chicago skyline. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. Judge Thorne just announced he's taking a leave of absence. Sarah hadn't wanted to destroy the judge's career. Her goal was bigger. She wanted to change the system that had allowed him to abuse his power for so long. Her assistant walked in with more files. Ms. Washington, we found something interesting. Judge Thorne isn't the worst offender in the circuit. There are 3 other judges whose numbers are even more biased. Sarah turned from the window. Send everything to James and call another press conference for tomorrow morning. As night fell over Chicago, lights stayed on in the Washington Tech Solutions building. The team worked late, knowing they were part of something important. They weren't just exposing one biased judge anymore, they were shining a light on decades of systematic discrimination. Judge Thorne had unknowingly picked the wrong person to discriminate against that Monday morning. His $2,500 fine was about to cost the broken system much more than money. It was about to cost them their comfort in operating in the shadows. 2 months after the courtroom incident, the Chicago Community Center was packed. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, and crowded the doorways. Sarah Washington stood on the stage, speaking to over 500 people who had been unfairly treated in traffic court. Today, we're launching the Fair Justice Initiative, Sarah announced, her voice clear and strong. This program will provide free legal help to anyone who believes they've been treated unfairly in traffic court. But that's just the beginning. In the front row, Jenny Martinez sat with her laptop, documenting everything. Behind her, a group of law students wore t-shirts with Justice for All printed on them. They were part of the new volunteer program Sarah had started. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves to be treated with respect, Sarah continued. It shouldn't matter what they're wearing, what color their skin is, or how much money they have in their bank account. The crowd erupted in applause. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had recently gotten help from Sarah's team. The judge had fined her $1,000 for a broken taillight. Sarah's lawyers had gotten the fine reduced to $50, the standard amount. At the back of the room, news cameras rolled. This wasn't just a Chicago story anymore. People across the country were watching. We've already helped 300 people appeal unfair fines, Sarah said, pointing to a large screen behind her. Together, these fines added up to over $500,000, money that had been taken unfairly from their community. The screen showed photos of families who had gotten help. A single mother fined $800 for parking in the wrong spot, a college student who got a $1,200 ticket for an expired meter, a retired teacher who had to pay $2,000 for missing a stop sign. But this isn't just about money, Sarah explained. It's about dignity. It's about justice. It's about changing a system that has been broken for too long. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Thorne's empty courtroom told its own story. Yellow sticky notes marked with evidence were stuck to his bench. Investigators still came in regularly, checking records and taking photos. Back at the community center, Sarah introduced her next surprise. Today, we're announcing a new app called Court Watch. Anyone can use it to record their experience in traffic court. The app will automatically analyze fine amounts and look for patterns of unfair treatment. The crowd murmured with excitement as volunteers began passing out phones with the app already installed. But that's not all, Sarah continued. Washington Tech Solutions is setting aside $50 million to help communities fight unfair court practices. This money will pay for lawyers, court fees, and investigations. No one should have to face an unfair system alone. In the audience, a young man named Marcus stood up, his voice shaking slightly. Miss Washington, he called out. Last year I lost my job because I couldn't pay a $500 traffic fine. It turned into $3,000 with late fees. I had to choose between paying the fine and buying food for my kids. Sarah nodded seriously. Stories like yours are exactly why we're here, Marcus. I'm happy to tell you that our legal team will be helping you appeal those fines tomorrow morning. The room burst into applause again. People were crying, hugging each other, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment. 6 months later, Sarah sat in the main hearing room of the Illinois Judicial Board. The room was completely silent as Chief Investigator Robert Martinez presented his findings about Judge Thorne's conduct. After reviewing over 10,000 cases from the past 5 years, Robert said, pointing to the screen behind him, we found clear evidence of systematic bias in Judge Thorne's courtroom. Judge Thorne sat at a table with his lawyers, looking much older. His hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook as he drank water. In cases involving minority defendants, Robert continued, fines were consistently 3 to 5 times higher than those given to white defendants for identical violations. This pattern was present in 92% of all cases reviewed. The board's decision was clear. Judge Thorne was removed from the bench, all questionable fines would be reviewed and refunded, and mandatory bias training would be implemented for all judges in the circuit. But Sarah's vision extended far beyond this single victory. The Fair Justice Initiative had spread to cities across the country. Court Watch apps were being downloaded by the thousands. Communities were fighting back against systemic injustice. As she prepared to leave the hearing, Sarah received one last piece of news. The National Judicial Council had adopted her team's guidelines for fair fines, making them the standard across the country. What had started as a simple parking ticket had transformed into a national movement for judicial reform. The billionaire had changed more than just one judge's courtroom, she had helped transform an entire system. Sarah Washington's story isn't unique. It's happening in courtrooms across America. By sharing, supporting, and standing together, we can create real, lasting change. What system will you challenge today? Remember, change begins with a single moment of courage. Every click, every share, every story brings us closer to a truly just system. Together, we can transform the institutions that were meant to protect us all.